am really delighted to see folks here this afternoon. My name is Bob Babcock. I've been kind of putting this baby together, 4 cities, with the delight to have an ear for Jane Ann as we travel around some, I don't know, 1,000 miles until I end up driving back home from Madison. It's been great talking with her. It's been great listening to her in Mason City last night. I think you guys are in a treat. Has anyone read any of Jane Ann's work in the past? You have? You have? When I was having some conversations with the people from the Community Environmental Legal Defense Fund, they mentioned about an issue of colonization. What, colonization? What about that? What does that have to do with community rights? And she explained some, and she said, you know, I'll get you the POCLAD book, she called it. It was an organization, a program on corporations, law, and democracy. It has a subtitle, which is actually, I think, probably the main title, and there happen to be copies back there if you want to take one home with you. Fairly inexpensive price, and she's got hers up here. I think she would be happy to autograph it, too. But the subtitle, which is actually the main title, Defying Corporations, Defining Democracy. And guess who has the lead essay in that book? But at any rate, this actually is what is intended to be a first step in building a coalition across eastern Iowa. There are now community rights groups. There's one in Winneshiek County. There's one here. There's one down in Jefferson County, and I'm starting one in Scott County, where I'm from. I'm from Davenport. And I'm hoping that there will be more, that people will talk to their friends in other counties and help get them going. So that in eastern Iowa, we have a coalition, what I'm calling the Community Rights Coalition of Eastern Iowa, that can come together, and when things are needed in different communities, maybe we can come together and make things happen in those communities and support those communities, so that when it comes time, for instance, to let a community, a county board know that they're supported by the people to support bills, community bills of rights and rights of nature and so on, that they understand that they've got the support. And just ask you all to welcome warmly one of the smartest women I've ever met in my life. And like I said last time, I can say that because my wife isn't here. Jane Ann Morris.
So thanks to everybody for coming. And before I get off on that, too much thanks to everyone who helped organize this. The logistics of just giving 4 talks in 3 days in a neighboring state can be overwhelming, and I really appreciate everything everybody did, including Bob and all of you who've already helped along the way. I also want to thank Community Rights Groundwork, which is the group with whom it's a group, and I'm going to just pass this around so you can take one of their brochures. Their goal is to assist community rights groups and interests everywhere in however they want to pursue their issue. And that includes legal background, legal concepts, substantial issues, and it also includes assistance with various aspects of group organizing depending on where you are. So all the information is in that brochure. They're responsible for me being there. I sort of work for them, and they work for whoever would like to have assistance. Since I'm talking about preliminary things, there's a table in the back. There are 3 books there, 4 books there, 3 of which I'm going to be waving and quoting from at various times here. They're for sale. There's only a couple of them, and a larger supply of my latest book, Gathering Down the Rabble, which is the book about the Commons Clause. The entire other half of the table is pamphlets and articles that I found at my house that I had duplicate copies of, and they're all free. They cover a variety of things that touch on community rights, including aspects of its origin, its sort of modern, this time around, origin in about 1993. So that's all available back there. Okay, I'm assuming what Bob determined about this audience, that probably many of you have a lot or somewhat contact with community rights and those concepts, but there may be a couple people here who haven't. So I'm assuming that I'm directing myself to that broad range, and hopefully we can talk about in questions afterwards if there are things that I have just really garbled and made unclear. Also, as Bob mentioned, at his suggestion, I'm going to take a break in my talk before I was actually going to start summarizing, so I'll tell you when that is. So we'll take a, I hope, somewhat short break, and you don't all head for the exits at that time. And then I'll come back and summarize my talk, and then I'll also be here for whatever comments, questions, conversations that we're able to have. So I have pretty much about an hour to kind of talk about community rights, and I'm not exactly going to do a cheerleading thing. I'm actually going to try and make it as clear as I can from the perspective of someone who's been involved in what is now known as community rights for about 20 years. And as for my biography, you're going to hear bits and pieces about me during my talk, so I'm not going to say anything else now. And of course, you can also ask questions later. But I do want to say two things right now. Number one, I'm not a lawyer, and so you're not getting legal advice or advice on legal strategies from me. I happen to be a corporate anthropologist. I've also done work in legal history. My book, Gabbling, is basically a whole book on less than one sentence of the Constitution, and it got some fairly good comments from lawyers. But anything I say to you is as like a legal historian or a corporate anthropologist, not a lawyer. I do have a website, which is democracythemepark.org, and a lot of the things I'm referring to today, and much of the work that I've done in the last 20 years, is available for free on that website. So I want to begin with the story, and then give you a 90-second version of my definition of community rights, just so we can be as close to on the same page as possible. So here's the story. I was involved for a long time in a fight against a giant project to strip mine a precursor of coal known as lignite, and then to burn it in a power plant. And it involved many, many regulatory agencies, from federal ones, EPA, Office of Surface Mining, Department of the Army, to state ones, to, very, very local institutions. And we took it through numerous regulatory agencies, and in fact appealed various of those decisions to court as well. But early on in it, there were some hearings when we first got to see the plans, and we got to respond to this in a hearing. And we looked over the plans, and we saw many things about them that told us, from our knowledge of the law, that this was not legal, okay? I'm just going to point out 6 of them. Number 1, it said you couldn't do a project like this if there was previous underground mining there. There were 8 or 9 mining companies that had done mines and sinkholes all over the place. Everyone knew there'd been mines. Go to the local museum and they would talk about it. Number 2, you couldn't do this project if there were endangered species there. Well, we had our own endangered species known as the Houston toad, which lives in what are called intermittent streams, of which there are many in Texas. I really enjoyed coming across Iowa and seeing all the rivers and stuff. Well, in Texas, there are as many rivers, but there's a lot less water in them, and not year-round. A third thing, there was a reason that you couldn't do this project, was if you had to move county roads. Well, we could see from the project there were plans to move several county roads. That's not going to work. Another provision was that you couldn't do a project like this near a park. Well, there was a park there. It wasn't a big park. It was a park. It was labeled a park. There was a little green spot on maps that it was a park. So we thought it was a park. There was another provision that said you couldn't do a project if you had to move a cemetery. There was one of these old cemeteries that you often find in the country that have trees growing near them since no one's plowed there in a long time. Well, there was a cemetery. And finally, they said you couldn't do a project like that if you were going to have to destroy prime farmland. Well, there was plenty of prime farmland there. So when we went to the hearing, we ripped their plan up, and we quoted their own studies, and we quoted their own laws, and just basically proved to them beyond a doubt that they couldn't do it. Well, it didn't turn out like that. So I'm just going to give you a glimmering of what happened in each of these cases. The previous underground mining, which everyone knew about, in fact, I had seen a sinkhole, which appeared occasionally in farmers' fields or in pastures, just, overnight, there it is, obviously because of abandoned underground mines. On that one, they got some engineers to testify that what everyone who lived in the county thought were abandoned underground mines were in fact, any ideas?
Natural samples.
Badger holes. And I was at the hearing where they said this, next to another activist, and we almost lost it, but it was badger holes. And I later looked up, and it turns out that if you look at naturalist records of where the range of badgers is, there has never been any badgers spotted in that county. Okay, so that wasn't going to work, underground mining. Endangered species, the Houston toad. What'd they say about this one? The one that lives in intermittent streams.
Not important.
No. They can deal with it. We have engineers. We will rebuild the intermittent streams. Now, if you know anything about the ecology of streams and water and rainfall and all that, it's really complicated, but the regulatory agents bought this. Fine, the engineers will rebuild the intermittent streams. Moving the county road. Easy peasy, okay? Because as it turned out, the county commissioners had been thinking about improving the road system anyway, and part of that would probably have involved a little rerouting of the road. And when they found out that the utility company was willing to offer a little bit of financial support for that, that was no longer an issue. Near a park. How'd they do this one?
They built a new park somewhere else.
We defined it as grass.
I wish they'd done that. That's closer. They got experts to go up there and testify, and this again is a quote, I could make this stuff up, that this wasn't really a park, it was a non-park park. And that therefore it wasn't like a park, and so it didn't matter that this was in the law, okay? The cemetery. I can visualize this cemetery. It was on a little road out in the middle of nowhere, as so many beautiful places are. And I went there on the day that they were going to take care of this. The first thing I saw were demonstrators lining the road. There were 20 or 25 people there. They were dressed up in their Sunday best, and they were all carrying signs to protest this, and one of the signs was RIP, resist interference by power companies, okay? So you looked behind them and you saw the cemetery, and along, it was small, maybe 40 or 50 maybe places. Along one side of it, they had put those white plastic chairs that people sit in, and they had laid over it all this felt, deep, dark, lush felt. And sitting in those chairs were some of the descendants of the people buried in the cemetery. And ministering to those people was a clergyman going from person to person, comforting them as they sat there while, what happened? Bulldozers actually were plowing out the graves and the area. You know, big loud machines, and every time they dug in there and dug something up and something was revealed, they would shut it down, and archaeologists with paintbrushes would jump into the holes and see if they had found the remains that might have been the remains of a casket or perhaps of a skeleton or other things that went with the burial. Anyway, the cemetery was taken care of in that manner. So the last example here, as a quickie, is prime farmland. How do you think they handled the prime farmland thing? Yeah, so, well, the thing is that prime farmland, we thought, meant a certain kind of soil, silty clay, clay loam, sandy clay, something with a specific name on it, and we thought this was one that they couldn't get out of. But we hadn't read enough of the regulations, because it turns out that although there is a U.S. Department of Agriculture definition of prime farmland, that the one we were dealing with was from the Office of Surface Mining, which accepted the USDA definition, but then added something a couple paragraphs down, which is what's called a historic use clause. And it basically said, if this has not been used to grow one of these crops for 8 out of the last 15 years or something like that, then it will not count as prime farmland for the purpose of this regulation. Anyway, welcome to the Democracy Theme Park. That's why my site is called Democracy Theme Park. It's because you see all these laws and all these regulations and they sound real good, but when you actually try to use them and apply them, you find that in many cases they're not really connected to anything. They're just sort of decorative. Okay? I consider this to be conventional activism, which involves work within regulatory agencies. And it's what we did for 7 or 8 years to fight different aspects of this project. The people who are working on the side of whoever's planning these projects, they're paid well, they work full-time, this is what they do for their whole life, they're specialized in getting around every single little provision there is. Okay, and if they don't have the specialized team there, they hire out. Their whole law firm's dedicated to eminent domain problems, to getting people in the middle of the country to sign leases they don't want to sign, and so on and so forth. Now, this is really discouraging when you come to the realization that, frankly, if you try to use our regulatory system through conventional activism, it's not going to work. It's very discouraging if you don't feel that there's any alternative and that you have no choice but to do it. And so that's why, in my own particular background, I was so glad that at about the same time I realized that I could not seriously and honestly recommend that people pursue this regulatory pathway, conventional activism. I fell in with a bunch of people who began to work on what has now become to call community rights. So really happy about that. So that's my story. And so now, just to start us off, I want to give my sort of 90-second definition of community rights. It has 3 parts. The first part is, don't bother with the regulatory agencies. For various reasons that we could go on about, historically they failed because they were designed to. They don't help us. They regulate citizens more than corporations or other activities. So don't do regulatory agencies. Number 2, work to pass a law that actually reflects what you want. In many cases, it's we don't want a whatever here. Frac sand mine, CAFO, pipeline, whatever it is. It's not always that form. Often it outlines like a system of food support or sustainable food production or whatever. So it doesn't have to be against something, but often it is. But have it reflect what you really want and not the kind of sideways language you end up using in regulatory agencies, which instead of saying no CAFOs, you have to talk about coefficients of expansion, the slope, the probability of 100-year rain, parts per million, where the wind's blowing, and so on and so forth. You could say, we don't want these here, okay? And the third part is what's really new about what has come to be known as community rights. And that part sort of looks ahead. And it involves things that most of us never deal with as part of the regulatory system. And that is, you take the 5 or 7 or 9 or 10 things that corporations will always claim after you've said, no CAFOs here, or no frac sand mining here. They're going to say the same 5 or 10 things all the time. And these are going to be claims to various powers and protections that corporations didn't have when this country started out and have gradually gotten. But what you do is you make a list of those claims, and I'll be talking about some of them later. Make a list of those claims and you say, and by the way, part of the law we're passing isn't just no CAFOs or no frac sand mining or whatever. It's to say, around these parts, these protections do not apply and are not recognized here because they interfere with the ability of our local community to exercise its democratic rights to protect itself. Okay, so that's the 3-part brief summary of community rights.